Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a recent report from Sweden that has really pulled back the curtain on something deeply troubling. It's a government inquiry that investigated international adoptions over decades, from the 1950s right up to the early 2000s. And, well, what it found was widespread abuse.
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive, using the inquiry's findings and reports from reputable international and Swedish media, is really to understand the scale of this issue and also to dissect the systemic failures that allowed it to happen and look at the recommendations and maybe the broader global picture too.
And honestly, the findings are pretty stunning. We're talking about things you might not immediately connect with adoption, like child trafficking, falsified documents. It was apparently happening on a significant scale.
Yeah, it reveals a much darker, much more complex reality beneath what many people saw as, a purely humanitarian effort.
So just to set the stage a bit, Sweden was a major player in international adoptions for a long time. From the 50s through the early 2000s, something like over 60,000 children were adopted internationally into Swedish homes.
That's a huge number. I mean, it puts Sweden right up there among the top receiving countries globally during that period. And look, for many Swedish families, this was genuinely driven by a desire to provide a home for children who needed one. That's clear. But that high demand, coupled with, let's say, insufficient checks and balances, both in Sweden and abroad, well, it created a kind of perfect storm for unethical practices to take root.
Right, so the demand was high, the system for oversight wasn't really keeping pace, and that's where this new inquiry led by Professor Anna Singer comes in. What did they fundamentally conclude?
The core finding is very clear and very disturbing. Thousands of children were adopted through illegal or unethical means. The inquiry concluded this wasn't just, isolated incidents here and there. It was systemic abuse that impacted countless lives over decades.
Thousands of children. Systemic abuse, that's incredibly hard to hear. What specific kinds of abuses did the inquiry actually uncover?
Well, the list is long and, frankly, deeply troubling. We're talking about outright child trafficking in some cases,
Mhm.
falsified adoption documents where a child's history or identity was completely made up, adoptions that happened without the biological parents giving truly informed or voluntary consent.
So parents being pressured or maybe even tricked into it.
Precisely. There were cases, believe it or not, of children falsely being reported as deceased to make them available for adoption, children being surrendered by people who weren't their actual parents, and disturbingly, even instances of children being stolen or kidnapped and then sort of laundered through the adoption system.
Wow. Just wow. And were these issues spread evenly, or did certain countries emerge as having more widespread problems?
The report did highlight issues in adoptions from a number of specific countries that were major sources for Sweden. Places like South Korea, Colombia, China, Sri Lanka, India, Chile, and Ethiopia. So it wasn't limited to just one region or country, but these were areas where significant irregularities were found.
That makes sense, given they were probably high-volume countries for adoptions. Now, the report points fingers not just at what happened abroad, but also at Swedish entities. This wasn't just a problem over there, was it? Who in Sweden was found to be, well, complicit in these systemic failures?
Yeah, and this is a critical part of the report. It found that various Swedish entities, and that includes government agencies responsible for adoptions, municipalities, the courts that approve the adoptions, and the adoption agencies themselves were complicit.
Complicit how, though? Like through active participation or more like turning a blind eye?
It seems to be a mix. The inquiry concluded they either knew about irregularities, they saw red flags and failed to act on them, or they simply failed in their fundamental duty of due diligence over decades, just didn't check properly. In some cases, the report suggests they knowingly allowed questionable adoptions to go forward. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a failure baked into the system itself over a very long time.
So the pressure for adoptions, the lack of really rigorous checks, and entities just not doing their job properly, it created a system where these abuses could thrive, both in Sweden and in the countries where the children originated.
Exactly. It was an interaction between failures in Sweden and failures, sometimes intentional failures, in the countries of origin, places where orphanages, intermediaries, or even parts of foreign governments collaborated in these practices or simply lacked proper regulation themselves, a failure at both ends, really.
It's one thing to talk about systemic failures and numbers, but I think the specific examples from the sources really underline the human cost here. Can you maybe share a few examples from particular countries?
Absolutely. I think that brings it home. Take Colombia, for instance. The inquiry found patterns where children were routinely declared abandoned without any real effort made to trace their biological families first. just labeled abandoned. There were also really disturbing accounts of mothers being actively tricked or pressured into giving up their children by social workers or other people acting as intermediaries.
Pressured by the very people who were supposed to be helping them.
Yeah.
That's a massive breach of trust. What about Sri Lanka? What did they find there?
From Sri Lanka, the sources describe cases linked to so-called baby farms, essentially places where women were housed and, in some instances, reportedly paid to give up their infants specifically for international adoption. There were also reports of midwives falsifying birth registrations to make it look like a child was legally available when they weren't.
Baby farms. I mean, it paints this awful picture of infants being treated like commodities. And South Korea was a huge source country, right? What patterns emerged there?
Yeah, South Korea was major. And the findings related to South Korea echo investigations that have been happening within Korea itself, actually. A very common issue found by the Swedish inquiry and documented by Korea's own Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the widespread falsification of adoption records. Many adoptees are now discovering that their original histories were just fabricated. A frequent tactic was listing children as abandoned even when they had living families. Korea's commission has found evidence of unwed mothers being coerced into giving up their children, records being deliberately falsified, children being taken under duress. It wasn't always a voluntary process, far from it in many cases.
Hearing these specific examples, children declared abandoned without checks, mothers pressured or tricked, records falsified, it becomes starkly clear why the human impact on the adoptees themselves must be so profound.
Oh, it is devastating. Absolutely devastating. You have to imagine growing up with a certain narrative about your origins, your family, and then decades later, maybe through DNA testing or finally connecting with people in your birth country, you discover that fundamental story was based on lies.
It just shakes the very foundation of your identity, doesn't it?
Completely. It can lead to deep feelings of disconnection, struggles with mental health, serious trust issues, and a profound sense of loss and not belonging. These aren't just abstract historical facts. These are real people whose lives were fundamentally altered, often damaged by these practices.
Okay, so given the sheer gravity of these findings, what did the Commission recommend Sweden do now? What's the path forward they proposed?
The recommendations are quite bold, actually. One of the most significant was to immediately halt all new international adoptions from Sweden. Just stop.
A complete pause on the entire system.
Yeah.
That really shows how serious they view the findings, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's a strong statement. Beyond that, they recommended establishing a robust national support resource specifically for adoptees affected by all this. This would provide critical services like therapy, legal aid to help them navigate complex issues, and assistance with searching for their biological families and origins. Practical help.
That kind of support sounds absolutely essential, clearly needed.
Crucially so, yes. They also recommended offering travel allowances, often called the right to roots, to help adoptees fund trips back to their countries of origin to search and reconnect. And of a very public, very necessary step recommended is a formal apology from the Swedish government to the adoptees and their families for the harm caused by these violations over the years.
Has the Swedish government responded to these recommendations yet? Have they said anything?
Yes, there's been an initial response. The Social Services Minister, Camilla Waltersson Grenvall, she acknowledged the harm caused and stated the government is committed to thoroughly analyzing the report and its recommendations before deciding on the specific next steps. So they're looking at it.
It seems like this isn't just a story about Sweden, though. You mentioned parallels in Korea and Colombia earlier. Are other countries grappling with similar issues? Is this wider?
Absolutely. This Swedish report is definitely part of a much larger global reckoning, you could say. Many countries that were significant receivers of international adoptions are finding they have similar histories of, well, questionable practices, systemic failures, and profound harm to adoptees. For example, the Netherlands halted international adoptions back in 2021 due to similar concerns. Switzerland has restricted adoptions from several countries over trafficking fears. And, as we mentioned, South Korea and Chile are actively engaged in processes, including investigations and efforts to help adoptees connect with stolen identities or families. It's happening elsewhere, too.
So this isn't some isolated Swedish phenomena, but more like a pattern that seems to emerge when high demand in wealthier nations meets maybe insufficient oversight or corruption in source countries. This really forces a reevaluation of the whole system, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The report And these broader global patterns, they force us to confront some really challenging ethical questions. Like, can international adoption truly function ethically when there are such vast power and resource imbalances between the countries involved?
You mean the dynamic between wealthier receiving countries and often much poorer countries of origin,
Hmm.
that imbalance?
Precisely. It raises difficult questions about whether wealthier nations should continue adopting from poorer ones, given this history of abuse, and what role historical dynamics like colonialism or even subtle or not so subtle racism might play in the global adoption landscape. And for those who were stolen, sold, or had their identities erased individuals whose fundamental human rights were violated, it prompts the question of whether forms of acknowledgement, maybe even reparations, are a just demand.
Hmm. It shifts the perspective dramatically, doesn't it? From just finding homes for children, which sounds good on the surface, to examining the complex and often fraught global power dynamics involved.
It demands a critical look at the entire infrastructure and the ethical foundation it was built on, or perhaps in some cases wasn't built on sufficiently. A really hard look.
So to sort of bring this deep dive together, the Swedish government inquiry is a landmark report, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
It exposes a dark, often hidden side of international adoption into Sweden, detailing how systemic failures allowed widespread abuses from falsified documents right up to child trafficking, causing immense harm to thousands of adoptees.
Yeah, it's forcing Sweden now to confront decades of, frankly, negligence and consider some pretty radical reforms. And in doing so, it's joining a growing list of nations grappling with their own complex histories in this area.
Which leaves us, and maybe you listening, with this significant question to consider. Given the historical abuses the report highlights and the ongoing concerns about the ethics of the system itself, what does the future of international adoption really look like? And maybe more importantly, how do societies genuinely acknowledge and address the profound, lasting harm done to those affected by these past practices? It feels like a crucial conversation that's only just beginning.